These are the two books that I have recommended the most to companies, clients that I've worked with, business leaders, organizations of all kinds for many, many years. And neither of them is like obviously a book about inclusive workplaces or, you know, making better cultures. And I think that's why I actually like to recommend them. So what are the two books? They are one that I have here, Rebel Ideas, The Power of, this one says The Power of Thinking Differently. When I first read this, it said it was called The Power of Diverse Thinking. It came out in 2019. It's by Matthew Syed. And the second book, which I'm sure I have somewhere, but I may have decluttered it out, was Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. So these are my two most recommended books. Why? Because when I sometimes go into organisations to do work with them around transforming the kind of workplace environment that they've got, they call me in and they think they know what they need to do, but sometimes they are slightly what I would call earlier in their journey. And by that I mean they're probably just not as, I don't want to say woke, but that's the only term that kind of keeps popping into my mind. But they're just not where they need to be in terms of like their level of awareness, their level of understanding of the different needs of, you know, different generations that are in the workplace, different people with different lived experience. You know, what are the challenges for people with disabilities? What are the barriers in terms of speaking up if you're coming into an organisation where everybody's gone to private school or public school and you haven't? Do you know what I mean? So basically, when I go into an organisation like that, where people are earlier on in what we kind of call like their maturity around this area, these are the two books that I recommend, especially when some organisations sometimes even have leadership book clubs. And so I recommend these two books. And why? Because they suit where they are. They're not obviously DEI books, so they don't like turn anybody off. And they talk about how we think and how we make decisions. And at the end of the day, that is important for any business, regardless of what you're talking about. That's important in terms of, you know, which market should we go into? What should we sell? What products? Which geography? You know, should we do that? Should we hire that person? Should we it just, how we think and how we make decisions as individuals and as teams affects everything. And that's one of the reasons I recommend it, because it's useful across the entire business, not just in terms of how people are managed and workplace culture. So that's another reason. The other thing I want to say as well, actually, in terms of the books that I recommend, and I recommend a lot of books, and if often, you know, just in any setting, I'm always recommending books because I'm always reading, and I always think that there's a book for every problem, right? One of the things is when I'm recommending books to companies, right, to clients, to businesses, unless a book has got an audio book as well, I don't recommend it. And that's because of accessibility. So some of that is because even I know that most of the time, unless I'm on holiday or I've got a lot of downtime, often I don't have time to sit and physically read a book. So a lot of my reading, a lot of my listening, I know that listening is not the same as reading. I know, right? A lot of my listening of audiobooks comes when I'm doing my morning walks, right? So and also, you know, we have individuals that, because of neurodivergence, they may be dyslexic, they may have other elements of neurodivergence, which means that a book is less accessible. And so that's why I'm always like, you know, if I'm going to recommend something, it has to have an audiobook. So both of these have audiobooks. I want to say they're both narrated by the authors, I think, which I really love. Just as a side note, and I'm going to do something about audiobooks, I love when authors narrate them because sometimes you get nuggets, you get bonuses. I don't think you do so much in these, but sometimes you do. In terms of Matthew Syed, so just going into the books then, the other reason I love recommending this is it is a really easy read, actually. Matthew Syed is a brilliant storyteller. He's a very, very good storyteller. He's really cracked it. And he also has a programme on BBC Radio 4 called Sideways, which is phenomenal if you haven't checked it out, where he delves into like some really weird and wonderful things. But he is fantastic. So it's a really easy read. And the other thing about it, and the reason that I recommend it to these organisations, is it really talks about the business case of having different ideas in a business, which really kind of like sits at the heart of the business case for diversity, right? There is also a moral business case about fairness, but we're not talking about that today. I'm talking just about the business case for like having different ideas. If you have different ideas, you get better outcomes, right? And so that's really good. The other thing that Matthew Syed does is he talks about the types of ideas where it's more important to have diversity and different ideas, and actually the types of business problems. So the types of business problems where it's important to have more diversity, and the types of business problems or business decisions where actually it doesn't matter. And those are like your very routine, very simple things. It doesn't really matter. You just need somebody to like get on with it, right? Because it's already known, etc. It's the more complex, more novel tasks or problems. That's where diversity is more valuable. So even just that thinking, I find is really useful for leadership teams. And also the other thing that Matthew Syed talks very much about in the book through a lot of the stories is how hierarchy and power distance can suppress diversity and suppress information and suppress, people giving their views at work. And so again, that's another reason why it's so useful for leaders. In terms of Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, and I would say this is the book that I used to recommend before Rebel Ideas, and actually probably before I'd read Rebel Ideas. Daniel Kahneman, again, because it's around the thinking, and there are still a few things that I take very much into my work, but I would say it's a harder read. It's a harder read than Matthew Syed, and so maybe that's part of the reason I don't recommend it as much. But some of the things that I take away from it, the pre-mortem, which actually, and even Daniel Kahneman said this isn't his framework. The pre-mortem was devised by Gary Klein, and it's this. There's a video on the pre-mortem. If I can remember to link it below, I will do. But basically, what you do is before you're about to make a decision or go down a certain path, etc., you have a process to analyze and almost like hypothesize about how that thing could go wrong, and you get people in the room to basically think of all of the ways that thing could go wrong. And it's a really good way of, again, encouraging different perspectives, encouraging sort of dissent and disagreement in a really healthy way. And so the pre-mortem is actually something that, on the back of hearing about it through Daniel Kahneman's work, I recommend it into a lot of organisations, and I use it quite a lot myself. And the other thing I would say with Daniel Kahneman's work, if you are a facilitator, so I do a lot of group facilitation, training, group coaching, etc., that kind of thing. If you're a facilitator, I think that Daniel Kahneman's book is brilliant for helping you figure out how to disrupt some of the biases that you get in a room when you're like facilitating with a group. So that is another reason as well that it's useful for organisations, because you can get techniques to interrupt and disrupt bias in meetings, in sort of like training settings and that sort of thing as well. So that's the other reason it's really, really useful. The thing about Kahneman, I think I mentioned that, he has had some criticism since the book was written, even though the book, he did get a Nobel Prize for his work, right? He's an economist, I want to say, Daniel Kahneman. So there was a lot in the book around priming, and there were like 11 of 12 studies that were quoted, and they got a little bit discredited. And he actually conceded publicly that he had put too much faith in underpowered studies, and that is, that's him acknowledging the bias that we have, that bias that's called, for example, confirmation bias. Sometimes we're looking for evidence that proves what we think, and there was probably a case of that even in terms of him putting his own book together, which I think that in itself is really interesting, and it's how kind of like life imitates the book or whatever, right? And life proves the theory out of the book. So any of the takeaways, I would say, these are two of my favourites, definitely. And I think if you work in that space or you work with leadership teams, these are good books to read. If you're tempted to buy these books and read them, maybe run a little bit of a pre-mortem before you commit to buying them, or certainly before you commit to recommending them. I don't recommend any books that I haven't read myself. If I haven't read them, no, I just don't. I just don't. I really don't. And there are some books that, and they probably won't come up in this series, because there are books that I read. I was maybe a little bit unsure about. Some I've read and they've been fine, and they may pop up in the series. There are one or two that, certainly around 2020, there were one or two that were being recommended a lot. And I read them and I was incredibly disappointed, and I never recommend them. And I don't really even talk about them. Maybe just very occasionally, if maybe there's like a flashpoint on LinkedIn or something, I'll be like, yeah, I'm not a fan of that school of thinking, and I kind of give my reasons why. So that's it. So in terms of my ratings out of 5, both of these for me are a 6 out of 5. If I could, on Amazon, if I could rate them a 6 out of 5, I would. And if I could give them a one-line verdict, you know, Syed is just a fantastic storyteller. So if you love stories and you love for learning to come through stories, then you'll absolutely love Syed. Who should read it? I mean, for both of these are for leaders. And, you know, if you're working in an organisation, you're struggling to get your leaders on board, you're struggling to get them to understand the business case of diversity, then they absolutely are the ones that should be reading this, whether it's audiobook or physical book, or even, and this is the other thing, when I recommend books, especially when I'm recommending them to leaders and individuals who are time poor, these actually have some quite good YouTube summaries, especially of some of the key concepts. I mean, Matthew's side, definitely, there's a couple of good summaries. If I have time, I promise you I'll put the links below. It's probably not going to happen, let's be honest about it. And then for example, the pre-mortem, there is definitely a video that talks about that, and I will do my best, I promise, to put the link to that below. So that's the thing that I would say. That's why they're good for recommending to organisations, because if somebody hasn't got time to spend hours listening to the whole book, they can always go and find the little YouTube summary version. So that's it. Which books have you recommended to your leadership teams? I'm really curious, especially if you've got leadership teams that would never pick up a book on inclusion or workplace culture or something like that. Which books have you recommended? That's it for today. That is my take. Let me know yours.